Hello friends, Jermaine here and welcome to this video. We're going to be resuming the starter kit we're building for single page applications, and specifically we're going to be building an Auth API which will be used for registering and authenticating a user, and also we'll look at how we can authorize logged in users using JSON Web Tokens. So without further ado, let's get into it. Alright, so let's create our Auth API router which will be mounted on top of this router. I'm going to create a new file on the source and I'll call it Auth API. And in here we'll import some Dart libraries as well as some shelf libraries. And let's not miss out our utils.dart file. We'll create our Auth API class, which will take in a store and a secret. The store will be a handle to our database collection. So this will be a MongoDB database, and the secret is a string that we'll use later on when it comes to validating our JWT tokens. We'll define a constructor which will accept the store and secret objects, and also we'll define a getter which returns an instance of a shelf router. And in order to address this error, we need to install the MongoDart package. So I'll come to the pubspec.yaml file and I'll add a couple of dependencies. I'll save this file and be sure to run pubget in the terminal, and then we'll import the MongoDart package, and that should resolve this class. We'll create an instance of router and then we'll return it. And before we define our first route, let's import this file into our sparserver.dart. We will define a mounted, and our prefix will be auth /, and then we're going to return to our sparserver.dart within the lib directory, and we just need to make sure that we are exporting our Auth API like so. Save that, and then in here we'll do Auth API.router, and we need to pass in the store and the secret. We'll import MongoDart here as well, and then before our router object we will create a database instance, and then we'll connect on DB like so. Connecting successfully means that we can now access our collection in the store, and we'll call it users. And let's move this app down here so that we make sure we connect to our database first before creating the router. We can pass in the store in here, and then for our secret, for now let's do my secret. We will update this later. Good, let's go ahead and add a route to our Auth API, and also make sure that the MongoDB server is running in the background. If you wish to know more about that, take a look at the MongoDB series that I have already. I'll return to the Auth API and let's add our first route. We'll make it a post route. Our endpoint will be register for creating a new user, and then in our handler we'll return a text response for now. And let's come to our server, and I'll just add a print statement here that says connected to our database, and then let's go ahead and run this. I'll hit F5. Okay, so we've connected to our database successfully, and should we attempt to access our auth endpoint, and we get register endpoint. And before we progress any further, it is recommended as a best practice not to store our database connection strings and our secret directly within the code itself. We would normally store it as an environment variable or in a .env file and then pull the actual values in here, which allows the flexibility when deploying to different environments, so whether it's dev or staging or production. So let's go ahead and create a .env file under spar_server. I'll create a new file. I'll call it .env file, and then in here we're going to configure two variables. The first one will be a secret key, and then we'll also add a configuration for our Mongo URL. And because we installed Envify and its related dev dependencies, we can use code generation by creating a new file on the source. I'll call it config.dart. We'll import Envify, and then we're going to define an abstract class called env, or in fact you can name it whatever you want. Envify also comes with an annotation called Envify like so. And then in this abstract class we'll define two static properties based on the variables we have in the .env file. So all of these will be static and const, Now we don't have this right now, so what we're going to do is we'll define a part directive, and then the file we want is config.g.dart, which we're going to generate in a minute. And then let's add the next key for our Mongo URL. So we can save this file, and then we'll seed into Spark server, and then run pub run build runner build. Okay, and once that build is complete, we see this file generated here. So we can click on that, and we see that it's pulled in the secret key and the Mongo URL from our .env file. So I'll close this now. And then what I'm going to do is add both files to our gitignore, because we don't want that to be tracked by source control. Okay. And to use our env class, we also need to export it from our library file. And then over here, we can do env.mongourl, and then I'll define the secret here as a const value so that we can pass that in here like so. Should we go ahead and reload our server? Everything should still work. Okay. All right, good. And we'll curl to our Auth API. Okay, still looks good. And also, common practice to do with these imports is, rather than having it here in our main executable file, we can export all of these from our library file. So effectively what we're doing is we'll just have one import here, and then if we come to spar server.dart, we can export all of these, and we'll replace import with export, and we'll get rid of this alias, and then I'll save that. So that means over here everything looks okay, and we just need to get rid of this alias. Then I'll save that, and should I reload the server, it should still be fine. Let's move on to our router in our Auth API and continue with the implementation of our register endpoint. So firstly, what will happen with this endpoint is that we're going to send a JSON payload containing a username and a password to add to our database. So let's retrieve that payload by invoking reader string on our request object. And to retrieve our user info, we'll decode that payload. And from our decoded payload, let's extract the email and password. Once we've got those, we can have a couple of checks. One of the checks we can do is to ensure that our email and password fields are present. So this is some basic validation. Of course, you can be a bit more specific by checking it's an actual email, but I'll leave that for you to figure out. The validation we're going to implement, if the email is null, or if it's an empty string, or if the password is null, or if the password is an empty string, then we'll return a 400 baud request, and the body will be a message asking the user to provide their email and password. If they've provided those, then we can check our datastore to ensure that this is a unique user signing up. And then we'll do store.findOne, and we want to find where the email matches this email. And then following on from that, we'll check that if the user is not null, that means the user already exists. So we'll return another baud request. If those two validations pass, then we'll proceed to creating the user over here. And in order to create a user, we can do await store.save, and here we'll pass in a map with the email, which will take in the email address, and then the password, which will take in the password like so. So should we reload our server and then go to Postman again, and then we run this, then our user is created, even though it just returns register endpoint. But if I go to our Mongo database, we see our first entry added here, like so. Okay, let's refactor the way we pass in the password, because it's not a good idea to store password as plain text in the database. I'm sure most of you know this already. So what we need to do is to define what's known as a salt, and then using a hashing algorithm, we'll hash our password and we'll store that in the database. So to do that, let's come to our utils.dart, and then we'll import the crypto package as well as a couple of Dart libraries. And then we're going to define two functions. let me just collapse this, called generate salt and hash password. And then in here, we'll create a random object, and then we'll generate a list of bytes. So what this essentially will do is it will generate a list containing exactly 32 integers, and each integer will be a number between 0 and 256. And then from there, we'll just return a base 64 encoding of our list of bytes. And then for our hash password function, this will take in our password, and then the salt we created from here. We'll define a codec object for encoding our password and salt. And then we'll define a HMAC object, which takes in an algorithm that will be used to hash the password. And then we'll generate a digest object using our salt. And then lastly, we'll return our hashed password. So we'll save that, and then we'll return here. And using those functions, let's create our salt and hashed passwords. So that means in here, we can pass our hashed password, and also we'll pass in the salt like so. So if we restart the server, go back to Postman, and then run this, then initially we get user already exists because it does already exist. But then if the user doesn't exist, then we get that, which should be our success message. So we'll say successfully registered user. And let's check our database. And we got our user here. And then the password is set as a hashed string using this salt. Let me remove the current users. Sorry, it's meant to be users. And then when I reload the server, and then when we come back to Postman and we run this again, then we get successfully registered user. And when we attempt to create a user again, then we get user already exists. All right, so we pretty much registered our user. Let's now look at the login flow for our user. So I'm gonna minimize this, and then over here, we'll define a post route for /login, and then we'll extract the email and password that we're trying to log in with. We'll retrieve the user from our database. And in fact, here as well, we can have the same validation that checks for the email and password. And then once we've got the user, we are going to hash the password that was passed in. And then we'll retrieve the salt from our user object. So all we need to do here is to compare the hashed password against the password that is stored on the user object. If it doesn't match, we'll return a forbidden response. Or else what we need to do is to generate our JWT, our JSON Web Token, and send that back with the response. But before we do that, let's for now return a response.ok that says logged in, and I'll restart the server. And then let's test this in our Postman client. So what we want to access is our auth/login. And then we'll send this across. So if we hit send, then we get logged in. And if the password is incorrect, for instance, then we get incorrect user and our password. And if this is incorrect, then we get an error, which is because we need to check that this user actually exists. So we'll do if user is null, then also we can return incorrect user and or password. So let's restart the server and try again. And there we go. Okay, so let's go ahead and generate our JSON Web Token. I'll come to our utils.dart file, and then we'll define two methods, one for generating our JWT and the other for verifying it. So to generate our JWT, I'll import the other package we installed, which is the Dart JSON Web Token. And then we'll define a JWT object, which will take in a payload. So at this instance, I'll define the issuedat field, and all these fields are based on the JSON Web Token specification and issue that. We'll take in a datetime object as milliseconds, and then we'll pass in a subject and an issuer. So the subject will be the user we're creating the token for, and then the issuer is whoever is generating the token. And then from that, we'll sign our JWT by invoking the sign method, which takes in a secret key object, and in here will be our secret string. And then to verify our JWT is to do JWT.verify, which takes in the token and the secret key. And then what we'll do is we'll return the result of that. So if this is valid, we'll get a JWT object back. But if it's not, then it'll throw an error. So we need to capture that by wrapping this in a try-catch block. And these are a couple of the errors that you get here. But then for our use case, we'll just leave it like this, which will return null as the result. We'll come back here to our Auth API, and then we'll retrieve the user ID from our user document, which is an object ID object. So we'll do the object ID, but then we want it as a string. So we'll invoke the toHex string method, which gives us the user ID as a string. And then we can generate our token by invoking generate JWT. The subject will be our user ID. The issuer, for now, I'll just put HTTP localhost, and the secret remains the same. In fact, we can have this in our .env file, but I'll leave that to you. So once we've generated our JWT, then we can have that in our response by encoding. We'll encode a map with a token field, and then the value will be our token. And then we'll set the correct headers because it's a JSON response. Content type header, and then our content type is JSON, and then we want the MIME type, which is a string. Okay, let's restart the server and try this again. All right, so when we log in, then we get this response with our token. So next, we need to figure out how to use this JSON token to access protected resources. So we can use our users API that we created in the last video. So for now, when I hit send, we get this users result, which is because we've not protected it. So let's do that now. And the way we'll do this is by defining middleware that will be passed in here. And then this middleware will verify our JWT that we pass in. So let's come to our utils, and then let's define our middleware. And I'll call this handle auth. And then we'll define this closure, which reflects what middleware looks like. And in here, we want to retrieve our token, which will be passed in via the authorization request header. And we'll create two variables. That will be null for now, which is because what we want to do is to check that the authorization header is not null. And also we want to check that it contains a bearer token by doing starts with bearer. If it does, then we're going to retrieve the token. And we're doing a substring because we want to extract every string that is after this bearer line. So to show you what that looks like, we will essentially set an authorization header like so, and then the value will be bearer space followed by whatever the token is. So then in here, when we do substring, we are extracting this part of the authorization value. So if the auth header is set, then we'll retrieve the token, and then we can attempt to verify our JWT, which will take in the token and the secret that we passed in here. And then we can modify our request context by doing request.change, and we'll define our context, which will be a map object containing the auth details, and the value will be our JWT. So it's either going to be null or it's going to be our JWT payload. So after all of that, we'll just return await, and then we'll invoke our inner handler function, which is this one here, and then pass in the updated request like so. So if you are from a Node.js background and you've done Express.js, this is equivalent to invoking the next function. And then we'll need to define another function that will check that we've got our JWT payload. So we'll call this function check authorization, And then in here, we'll return the result of invoking create middleware. We'll define our request handler. And then in here, we can check if the request auth details is null, then we'll return a response.forbidden that says not authorized to perform this action, or else that means that we've got a valid token. So we'll just return null, which will invoke inner handler behind the scenes. So to use these two functions, we'll come to our sparse server. Before add handler, we'll add middleware. We'll invoke handle auth, which takes in our secret. And then in our users API router, we'll define a pipeline object, and then we'll invoke add middleware. This middleware will check for authorization, like so, and I will make this relative. And then we'll invoke add handler and pass our router in here. So similar to what we're doing in sparse server.dart. And then we can return handler back. And we also need to set the type to handler. So what's happening here is that when we make a request to retrieve this JSON string, then the request will be passed in our middleware, and we'll check that the token is valid. If it's valid, then we'll go ahead, pass the request in here, which will return our user, or else we return a forbidden response. So let's restart the server and let's test this out. So if I hit send, then we get that. And let's use a valid token. So we use this token which was created earlier on. So after bearer, make sure you have a space and then the token. And let's send. And there we go. Okay, so that works. And also because we've added the JWT object to our request context, we are able to access it in here. So I'll create a variable and I'll do request.context, which is a map. We'll retrieve our auth details key and we'll cast it as a JWT and make sure to import .JSON Web Token. So from here we can do user, and then we can load our user from the store, which reminds me we need to pass in our store. Let me import MongoDart like so, and then we'll create our DB collection, and let's make sure that we've got the constructor. Then we can do store.find1, and then we want where the underscore ID field name matches the value in our JWT. So because the value is a string and underscore ID is an object ID, we need to do object ID dot from hex string, and then we'll do auth details dot subject. So from there we can modify our response, and I'll just do email, and then in here I'll just return the email. And let's save that. I'll restart the server, open Postman again, and let's send. And we need to pass the store in here like so. Let's run this, and then in Postman, when I hit send, then we get the email back. And then if we wish to log out, we will implement a logout post route. And then in here, we're going to check our auth details in our request context object. If it's equal to null, then we'll return a forbidden response, because essentially it should be a logged in user which is performing this call. So if it's an authenticated user, and then we can go ahead and log them out. But for now, let's just return response OK, successfully logged out. So I'll restart the server, come back to Postman, and then in our logout endpoint, if we hit send, then we are told we are not authorized to perform this operation. However, when we specify a bearer token, and in fact I believe we can set that here as well, and if I hit send, then we get successfully logged out. Okay, so you would have noticed that with our JWTs, even though we restart the server and everything, these tokens are still valid. So whenever we log out, we need to make sure that we invalidate these tokens somehow, which usually involves setting an expiry date on the JWT. And then when it expires, we either log the user out or we issue a new token. But that's going to be for the next video. Let's refactor our sparserver.dart for specifically these two. So for our create static handler, I'm going to create a static file API and then mount it like how we've done with these two to be consistent. So on the source, I'll create a new file. I'll call it StaticAssetsApi. I'll pull in the relevant libraries. I'll define a StaticAssetsApi class, which takes in a folder path. We'll have our router, and then we'll have our get route. And in here, we'll define a path variable, which matches any string. We'll create an asset path, which is a combination of the folder path we'll pass in, as well as the requested URL from the request. And then we do substring 1 because we want to ignore the very first character, which is a /. And that is because if we do not substring, this is treated as an absolute URL, which will therefore ignore this folder path. So if I hover over this, we are trying to avoid this bit. So if a path is an absolute path, then anything before it will be ignored. So we don't want to ignore the folder path. That's why we are doing this. And we'll do an await, and we'll invoke the create function, which takes in our asset path. That returns a function, and we need to invoke that function and then pass in our request, like so. So now we can export this from here. And then in here, we'll do app.mount to our assets. We'll have our StaticAssetsApi with our folder path, and we'll do .router. And in fact, I'll just simplify this since it's required anyway. So that looks like that, which is consistent with these two. And then I'll restart the server, and let's go ahead and test this out in our browser. So visiting localhost 8080 is still loading our styles, as we can see over here. We can access the styles directly as well, which gives us that. Okay, so that's good. And also we can refactor this one a little bit as well. So what I'll do is I will cut that bit, and then I'll paste that in utils. Then I'll create a function called fallback, which will return this function. And then we don't need this bit. Fallback also will take in an index path, and then we'll pass that here instead. So then what this means for us is we can come over here, and then we'll do fallback followed by the path to our index file. And we can also do .o if we want. So as a result of that, this looks much cleaner and much more legible in my view. I'll restart the server, and then visiting localhost 8080 still gives us our index page, so that's good. And also let's come to Postman, and let's put in a random route which will return our index, because all is capturing all the routes regardless of the HTTP methods, which you can leave it like that if you want. Alright, so at this point I am going to end the tutorial here. In the next video we'll look at how we can properly invalidate our JWT tokens once we log out. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit the like button and share this across your social media channels. If you're not a subscriber, hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon so you don't miss out on the next update. If you've got any questions or wish to provide feedback, let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.